This video is brought to you by Marvel Snap, but more on that in a moment. Temple of the False Gods. I love this card, but I never ever put it in any of my decks. I actively exclude it. I have, I think, 10 decks built or in pieces, and none of them have False Gods in it. And it's not because it's the last cut like Sun Titan often is. And it's not like how I like Spell Thief and love that card for the memories that I have with it, but it's not playable in Commander. I love Temple of the False Gods because it brings something truly unique to both Magic, Commander, and the surrounding conversation around it. I think it's a really good bit of game design. I have in the past told people not to play Temple of the False Gods, and that opinion has not changed that dramatically. I still believe that, really, people shouldn't put this in their decks. I think being able to make your land drops, play your spells early is so important. But Temple of the False Gods isn't a straightforward, terrible card. In fact, there's been a hell of a lot of discussion around whether the card is stone cold unplayable, like I say, or the fact that it's reasonable inclusion because of how good it is in the late game for non-competitive EDH decks. In today's video, I want to talk about not which side I side on. It's very clear that I side on the it's not good enough side, but I want to talk about the fact that that discussion exists is actually awesome. I want to talk about having cards that aren't best in class but also aren't draft chaff, that are somewhere balanced, perhaps is a good word to use, is actually excellent. I want to talk about how Temple of the False Gods might be one of the best designed lands in the whole of Magic. This isn't draft chaff or bulk rare. This is the platonic ideal of a Magic card design, which is a funny statement because I don't believe that that's the right way to use platonic ideal, and I don't even like the card or play it. All that and maybe a little bit more in today's video. But first, this video is brought to you by Marvel Snap, who are releasing the full screen PC client as of today. Of recording, you might be seeing this later in the week, but this week, the week you're watching this, they're getting the full screen client. If you haven't played Marvel Snap yet, it's Marvel's mobile game of the year at the Game Awards. It utilizes quick games over 6 turns of tactical card gameplay. It is quite honestly and easily my favorite digital card game out there at the moment because it's refreshingly different to everything else, but it's also quick and punchy and fulfilling because you have so much agency in what you're doing. It features tons of classic and iconic comic book art across 220 cards currently and 115 locations, with over 1,300 unique art variants of those cards, with a new card being added every week. To celebrate the release of the full screen full client, they're running events throughout the week. Twitch drops are active for 3 unique card variants across this week from between the 22nd and the 29th of August. If you log in this week, every day has a new premium variant as a bonus for signing in. I'm generally quite excited because I really like the game and I would love to stream it on a better looking client as we're getting on PC now. I've mainly been playing the death deck at the moment because I love playing really chunky Deadpools and 3 deaths for huge swings in turn 6. Logging in through Steam will get you a unique Mech Devil Dinosaur, which might bring me back to playing Moon Dinosaur Control, and you can use my link in the description below to download and play Marvel Snap on Steam to unlock that exclusive Mech Devil Dinosaur card variant today. Thanks to Marvel Snap for sponsoring this video. Let's talk about what Temple of the False Gods is. It's what many people call a soul land. Soul lands are lands that produce 2 mana. A City of Traitors is one of the most famous ones that's on the reserve list, and probably the best of them all is Ancient Tomb. You could argue that City is better because of the lack of life loss, but if you are planning to play more lands and continue playing the game, Ancient Tomb's significantly better, especially if you talk about Commander where you have 40 life. Ancient Tomb's downside is a fascinating one in terms of balancing the fact that it's a land that produces 2 colorless mana. Of course, before someone says it, isn't Gaia's Cradle or Tolarian Academy better or blah 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 blah? Of course they are, but they need setup. You need to have creatures or artifacts in land in play, respectively. Same for Sarah Sanctum with enchantments. Ancient Tomb doesn't give a shit. Ancient Tomb just gives you the mana no matter what. But the downside is the loss of life. 2 life loss. Now, of course, immediately you can think about how this isn't necessarily a downside. Some decks in Magic like to lose life. Weirdly, Ancient Tomb is often not used in decks that are trying to lose life to their advantage, but it could be if it was a more extreme one. I'll explain that more in a moment. But the 2 life loss isn't enough to stop it being a 4 of in multiple legacy decks. Decks that want to play 2 mana and 3 mana lock pieces, or decks that just want to play 3 mana with 2 colorless mana being part of its cost, and combo off of a singular card. Ancient Tomb has been a massive part of Legacy since its inception, or since it got printed, and will continue to be forevermore out of Magic. So it's clear that losing 2 life to get a soul land activation isn't that balanced. It isn't that much of a downside. So what would be more of a downside would perhaps being something that would deny the mana for a little bit. Coming into play tapped is an often used phrase for lands to balance them. The common and uncommon cards that fix your mana in draft archetypes are normally ETB tapped to make them worse than the rare versions to make those chase cards. That's a whole different video. Kind of sucks that that's the case. But ETB tapped isn't really that much of an elegant solution because it only stops you for one turn, and there's also weirdly gameplay ways to break that. Did you know that an Amulet of Vigor will actually untap any tapped land? That's how a deck like Titan and Modern can play a Titan so early. This is kind of a part of Magic now, where the game's been going for 30 years and there's 25,000 cards or whatever, so what you're going to get is even the downsides on some cards will be broken by cards printed later that somehow turn this downside into a massive benefit. A very good example of this is Lion's Eye Diamond, which is the fixed Black Lotus. In order to utilize it, you must discard your hand, which means you can't utilize it to cast spells in your hand, only to activate abilities, let's say. Of course, once you discard your hand though, you can use that to dredge things, which is historically where Lion's Eye Diamond has seen the most play, in Dredge and Legacy. Or you can flash back cards, and in more recent times, Echo of Aeons has been a card that is 3 mana to flash back, and it's a shuffle your hand and draw 7. So you can crack your LED to draw a fresh hand of 7 once you made your land drop and played your other artifact mana. And to go back to Ancient Tomb as an example, we had this interesting conversation on my Discord about how would you balance Ancient Tomb? How would you make Ancient Tomb not too broken to be played in Modern, or dare I say it, Standard? And the first thing was like, how much life loss can you let it take? 5, 10, 15? Whilst these things would be scary and they would hurt you a lot, and they'd also limit the number of activations. Like an Ancient Tomb with a conventional life total of 20 can only be activated 10 times, of course. Commander can activate 20 times. Once you start moving that up into, things divisible by your life total, you get to the point where at 5 life, you can activate it 4 times. At 10 life, Ancient Tomb can only be activated twice without gaining life before you die, which would be bad, right? And there's situations where activating an Ancient Tomb would drop your life by 10 and allow you to play Death Shadow on turn 2 as a 2/2. Cards like Death Shadow, as an example, are how life loss is not the balancing factor that you think it might always be. It's weird, right? Ancient Tomb losing you 2 life is not good enough to play it in the Death Shadow decks. Also, they're quite color intensive on the spells you want to cast. But if an Ancient Tomb did 6 or 7 damage to you, there might be a world where you do. So what other downside could you put onto Ancient Tomb? Could you have it mill you for 5 or 10 or 15? Lands that put parts of your library into the bin are incredibly good. Again, I'm going to say it, one of the scariest mechanics in Magic for Dredge. Imagine turn 1 activating a Tomb to get some mana and putting 5 cards in your bin, and then one of them has Dredge, and you pay 2 mana to cycle a card and suddenly you're dredging. Yeah, that would be broken as shit. So the next step is, how many cards could it exile before you think it's too good? Like, is exiling 20 cards, essentially taking a Nulamog hit to the face, too rough? That's 3 activations, you have no library left. Well, you could play a bigger library, Yorion, or you could play a Battle of Wits. And beyond that, losing your library isn't as bad as it once was, when there are multiple cards in the game that care about you having no library in order to win the game. What I'm getting at is that it's very hard to balance Magic cards with a downside that makes sense, that stops them from being abusable. Enter stage left, the subject of today's video, even though I haven't spoken about it for about 4 minutes, is Temple of the False Gods. I keep calling Temple of the False Gods, as a reference, it's Temple of the False God, because it's referring specifically to Corona. It taps for 2, but you can only activate this ability if you control 5 or more lands. Now, you aren't often waiting until turn 6 to be able to activate this to jump you from 6 to 7. You would be just making land drop after land drop, but you're playing Commander, a format where casting Cultivates and Kendamas is normal. The format outside of the CEDH levels is relatively slow, and thus you have time to facilitate getting to Temple with ramp. But having to wait until you have 5 lands in play, because lands have this rule in Magic where you can play 1 a turn, is actually a really reasonable way to balance this. So reasonable, in fact, the card has been dog shit in competitive Magic. In normal Magic, where you have to play against your opponent and you have 4 of a card, and you might have 4 copies of Temple of the False God in your deck, drawing any one of those 4 in your opening 7, which is like a 40% chance, I think is the rough maths. I have to look that up.
5 minutes later.
I looked it up. It's around 40%. But drawing one of them in your opening hand, or in your first few draws, which makes it more and more likely to get it, is bad. But in Commander, you can cast Cultivating Katama's Reach quite confidently, quite competently, and quite regularly, without being absolutely punished by some dickhead playing mono-red 1-drops. You know the kind of person. The person makes burn their personality. Like Metachemist. But of course in Commander there's the argument that I make, where playing anything that stops me from advancing my board state or game plan on the first 4 turns of the game, like a tapped land, makes me feel, it makes me icky. I actually have an allergic reaction to it. It makes my arsehole swell up like an inflatable dinghy, and the only cure for that is cream. But that cream can only be applied by my patrons. You can sign up to my Patreon via the link in the description below to help support the channel with a regular donation of $2 a month, which helps me put cream on my balloon knot. And like I said, I don't like to play anything that stops me playing these spells. Tap lands are the issue for me. but many people see the reward of being play 7 and 8 drops early off their Sol Ring lands and a Temple of the False Gods or whatever. They see that as worth it. If it's in your opening hand, you can just mulligan it away. You get a free mulligan in Commander. It's even less punishing. And I do think there is merit to this. Being able to just play on turn 4 or 5 after ramping to get 2 mana is very powerful. Solands are very powerful. Of course, when it comes to CDH, where I believe this card sees absolutely zero play, where everything's much more mana efficient and low to the ground and interaction heavy, that's perhaps proof, I don't know why I'm inverted like that, proof that this card is not good. But that's a metagame choice. When everyone's playing a lot slower and you aren't playing CDH, you can kind of allow for this kind of thing. And that's what I love about it. It's not strictly worse than Ancient Tomb. Oh, that's not a good example. Ancient Tomb is so good that it's best in class. And that means, when I say best in class, it means that every other card in that slot or that role is comparably worse, including City of Traitors that I mentioned earlier. Playing this on turn 6 or turn 5 if you've ramped, or turn 4 if you've ramped twice, but playing it on those turns and taking no damage makes it better than Ancient Tomb, which means there is a payoff, there is a reward to that risk. And that brings us back to that conversation, that discussion around, is it good or not? I just really like it when there are Magic cards that aren't strictly the best, or aren't strictly the worst. And of course, every time they try to do this, every time they try to make a downside that isn't a thing that can be abused, for example, there are failures to that experimentation. For every Temple of the False Gods, there is a Ristic Cave, for example, a card that is absolutely dogshit if anyone has any mana left up during the turn cycle. On the flip side, there are experiments in this where don't work, like Eldrazi Temple. A card that was not a problem until they did a second design mistake, which kind of compounded the issue by printing cheap and efficient 5, 4, 3, and 2 mana Eldrazi that then meant that this thing is effective from turn 1. In many ways, it used to be a Temple of the False Gods because you aren't casting the big fucking thing until late in the game. They broke it by turning off that clause by giving us 2 drops, which also were even more broken with Eye of Ugin. And I used the word failure there in that experimentation, and compounding mistakes, but I don't think those cards shouldn't exist. I don't hate them. If anything, I think playing with powerful Magic cards is probably the most fun way to play Magic. There's a reason that I like to play the older formats, Commander, Legacy, Modern, to an extent other things like Historic and Vintage as well, because I prefer playing with the good cards in Constructed to playing with bad cards in Limited. So when I see a card that can actually be openly discussed in a format as having swings back and forth as to whether you should play it, it has a downside that doesn't get abused by the latest dumb shit, I think that's wonderful. I genuinely think this design might be one of the best designs they've ever done, and it only began to shine when we got to Commander, which is true for a lot of card designs actually. I think Temple of the False Gods is great because it has a balancing factor that is balancing it in a way that isn't abusable by some other card. I think there's very unlikely to see a card in the future that counts as having 5 lands in play or something similar. That's the closest I can get to my head of theory crafting mechanics that might break Temple of the False God. But I guess people probably said that about Lion's Eye Diamond once upon a time. I think the idea of is it worth it and is this a risk I want to take is a fantastic line of reasoning that players get to go through with Temple of the False God. I love that conversation. And that's why I love Temple of the False God, even though I'm never, ever putting it in one of my decks. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Do you play it? Do you not play it? And even if you fall on one side of the fence or the other, can you appreciate how cool of a design it is that we can have this discussion about how it factors into a slow battle cruiser format like your average EDH table? Let me know what you think in the comment section below, and don't forget to check out that link to Marvel Snap. Helps to support the show. And also Marvel Snap is really good. The gameplay loop is actually one of the best gameplay loops I think you'll find in the digital card space. I recommend it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Ta-ta for now.